Okay, let's go. Welcome everybody to our Mass Timber Office Forum. This is the first panel session. It's related to insurance. My name is Matt Holman and I'm a partner at Gardner and Theobald. The feedback from the introductory session was fantastic. Thank you all for your thoughts and questions that have fed into how we've shaped this session. We've been overwhelmed by the interest in the forum and we're set again to have a 3-figure attendance list. The agenda today, we're going to give you some updates to the forum. We're going to introduce our panellists. The rump of the session today will be our Q&A with the panellists, which will also incorporate some poll questions to you, the audience. Time permitting, we also hope to incorporate some live questions towards the end that my team will filter to me during the session. I'll then wrap up by introducing our next session on the 1st of September, which is related to fire testing and building control. So a few updates from me in relation to the forum. Following your feedback, we've brought the sustainability panel forward, and this will now take place on the 6th of October. Our panellists for the leasing panel are also now confirmed. Our engineering session, we've added an acoustic specialist to the panel. And lastly, we've expanded the number of sessions to include one on architectural design. Over now to my colleague Oliver Booth to introduce you to our panellists today.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everybody. We're very privileged and thankful to our panellists today for giving us this rare insight and opportunity to ask them direct questions about their thoughts on insuring mass timber office buildings, both during and post-construction. Our panellists and experts come from different disciplines within the insurance industry. Nick Tilley is Property Technical Risk Manager at AXA. Nick has been at AXA for 3.5 years and is responsible for leading the Property Technical Risk Management strategy for their in-house risk survey teams, liaising with external organisations such as the BRE, Fire Protection Association and the RISC Authority. He was previously the Commercial Property Global Technical Manager at AIG and has also worked at a broker in a career with risk engineering since 1986. Caroline Hairsine is Head of Construction at Aviva. Caroline has spent 20+ years in construction insurance, including time at Zurich as Head of Civils Construction for the EMEA region and as a class manager for construction at a Lloyd's syndicate. Caroline moved to Aviva in 2019 as Head of Construction and LDI. Andy Penny is Head of Construction at Zurich. Andy has over 30 years claims and underwriting experience at Zurich, predominantly in construction and the engineering business. Since the formation of regional construction teams 20 years ago, he has been responsible for underwriting strategy and performance of Zurich's UK domestic construction insurance business. Andrew Desmond is Senior Vice President at Marsh. Andy is the Head of the UK Business Development for Construction, Infrastructure and Surety practice at Marsh JLT Specialty. He started his career 25 years ago as a construction insurance broker. For 20 years, he was insurance manager at Kier Group PLC before moving back to broking again to join the team at Marsh at the beginning of 2020. David Lyle is Senior Vice President at Lockton. David heads up the UK construction team at Lockton, which is the world's largest privately held independent insurance broker. He advises contractors, developers and lenders on risk and negotiating insurance premium and coverage for some of the largest developments in the UK. Robert Inez is Senior Risk Engineer at Zurich. Robert is a chartered engineer with 10 years in industry experience for Arup and 3 years experience as a Senior Risk Engineer for Zurich. His role within Zurich is to evaluate and assess the key construction risks at both pre-insurance placement stages and post-insurance placement. The role is to assist the underwriter in determining whether the project is viable, to ensure an input into the level of insurance premium, and ensure the risk profile is well managed during construction. Dominic Lyon is Associate Director at Gallaghers. Dominic is in the real estate team at Gallaghers, having previously worked in construction for 4.5 years. Gallaghers are partner broker to the Structural Timber Association, and Dominic takes the lead on this, whilst promoting awareness within the insurance industry of mass timber construction. And finally, Oliver Wright is Construction Risk Consultant at Aviva. Oliver is a member of the Construction Insurance Risk Engineering Group and chaired the recent update to the best practice guidance on managing escape of water risk on construction sites in its 5th edition. Oliver was an international senior construction risk engineer working at Aviva and previously held risk engineering positions at Generali and Zurich. Before we begin, I'd just like to say how thankful Matt, I and the team are to our panellists for being so enthusiastic and engaging during the preparation for today's forum. It's hugely appreciated. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Ollie. What a great panel. Okay, let's get straight into the Q&A session. We've got lots to cover. We're a bit pushed for time in terms of the amount that we wanted to cover, so let's get straight into it. So let's start with Caroline Hairsine of Aviva. In the introductory forum to this series, the audience voted that they believed insurance to be the #1 barrier to market for mass timber office buildings. What are your thoughts on this, and what would you say the #1 barrier is to the market and why? Just to start things.
I was quite surprised to see that that was the #1 barrier, mainly because as an underwriter, we're almost sort of the last minute, we forgot to buy insurance. We start digging on Monday. We need an insurance policy. So to hear that, it was quite a surprise. For us, I guess personally, I thought the barrier would be more around the acceptability by the wider public and the use and habitation of mass timber buildings around the fire and water issues. And for us, that's our biggest concern is fire, which won't come as a surprise, but also the water damage arising either from putting out the fires or that are a big contributor to losses in the construction insurance market at the moment.
Great, that's a helpful
timber
start.
compared to concrete is a lot more substantial.
Yeah, okay, that's great, Caroline, thank you. Ollie, should we get our first poll question done, just for the audience to get everyone livened up and awake?
Yeah, so this is the first of 4 polls today, everybody. Which stage of the project are you finding to be the most challenging when seeking insurance cover? Is it during construction? Is it post-construction with the built asset? Is it both? Or do none of these problems, none of these things are problems for you on your project? We'll now just take 30 seconds or so to let you all click your mouse buttons, and then I'll read out the answers.
Votes are in.
Thank you, everybody. So 30% of people found during construction the biggest challenge. 18% found post-construction, the built asset, the biggest challenge. 32% found both of them to be a challenge, and 20% didn't have a challenge with finding insurance for mass timber buildings, office buildings at all. Thanks, everyone.
That's interesting. We'll probably come on to that with the panelists towards the end, actually. Okay, Robert Ennis of Zurich. How does the industry view risks in mass timber offices, both during construction and the built asset? That's a nice wide question for you.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd just like to say, I don't think the insurance industry is against the use of timber. It's something that the insurance industry has underwritten and will do. It's but I think, as Caroline alluded to, it's about managing the 2 key risks for us, and that's fire risk and the escape of water risk. And as a result, we consider those timber to have a higher risk profile. So, I mean, timber doesn't perform as well as steel and concrete under fire as a natural material. So when you look at, temperatures in the region of about 300 degrees, timber loses all of its structural capacity, whereas steel and concrete still has the majority of its structural capacity. And one phenomenon which is not necessarily addressed by the design codes is where actually timber will continue to decay beyond even its fire performance. So you could design it for 120 minutes of fire life for fire safety, for evacuating people and occupants and getting firefighters in there, but actually will continue to lose strength beyond that point, whereas that's not seen by steel and concrete. And again, it's just something that's worth considering from an insurance point of view. We actually, we're very, life safety is highly important to us, but also property protection.
Yeah.
Something that's necessarily covered by the design codes. So again, there is actually an approved document B version where we actually have the insurance requirements. Again, these are just requirements that are more onerous than current design guides. So, and that's all to protect the property. So that's why, we see it as a higher risk, because if your building's on fire, there's a good chance that you'll actually lose the main structural frame, even if you can demonstrate it has the required design performance. And we often see, the response about charring that could provide natural fire protection, which is great, but what we find is actually that can delaminate, and that can actually increase the fire load because you're actually then adding more material into the fire. As it burns, it also gasifies, which increases the fire load. So these are phenomena that you don't actually see with steel and concrete. Caroline mentioned about escape of water. And again, this is a really big area for the insurance industry. It's where we see a lot of claims. And again, it's how does that material perform in an escape of water event, or when it's got a change in moisture levels. And these are things that we don't actually see with steel and concrete. So this is why we consider this to have a higher risk profile than other materials. And that's our overall sort of view of the material in use.
That's really helpful, Robert. Thank you for that. And we'll get into fire in particular in our next session in a month's time. Okay, Oliver Wright of Aviva. Does the insurance industry differentiate between timber products, such as timber frame, as opposed to mass engineered timber? And what level of specification details does the insurance industry go into?
So I would say that every project, certainly every large project, is sort of viewed on its own merits. On the one hand, whilst there are many different timber products, as Robert's alluded to, fire is still the main risk. So if it burns, in our opinion, it burns, whether that, regardless of the speed that may take. But with that being said, that other aspects of the risk have to be taken into account as well. For example, if I'm a construction risk engineer, so on the construction side of things, when I'm doing my review, it would include things like the location and security. So not just the materials themselves, but what's going on at the site, how are they protecting throughout the construction period. I know there's a lot of focus as well that are put onto sprinklers. And I know that there's some work going into that on the construction side for temporary sprinklers, but I think with a lot of things, part of the challenge for insurers is that the mass timber, the architectural differences for every single product or project, and the speed at which the materials are being put out, that's a challenge for us that we need to take on board. But also it goes back to the fundamental aspects for us of the risks of fire. So what else is being done on those projects to try and reduce that risk? Okay.
That's good. That's good to start. I mean, as you allude to there, it's a case by case basis, isn't it? It can be quite a lot of detail. So thanks, Oliver, for that. Andy Penny of Zurich. This is a great question. How do actuaries, risk assessors, and underwriters approach the evaluation of risk and premium on mass timber office buildings?
I think in the UK we don't have a huge experience of them. So our local experience isn't great. We do have data from other territories. However, their building codes, building standards, and methodologies might vary a little bit. So we're down to really using our risk engineers and looking at the structure of the building, the nature of the building, and a lot of it's common sense, really. So what's the layout of the building? Are you likely to lose the whole building in a major fire? Obviously, if it's a single multi-story building, then yes. If it's more evenly, if it's better distributed, then you might have a chance of saving some of it. It just depends on the nature of the building and the layout. We need to consider, as well as fire and water escape, we also need to consider the methodology of the build. So from a timeline point of view, what's going in when? So what are the fire protections that are going in? What are the protections during the actual building itself? Ingress of water is another problem we've had. It's fire and water. It isn't necessarily an escape of water. It might actually be weather damage. Just depends on the nature of the building and how it's being built. Location, obviously. Arson is a major factor for us. So where is it? What about storage facilities on site? Is there room for welfare facilities, or are they right next to the building? All of these things are, because you're writing the individual risk, all of these things should be known to the underwriter when they're assessing the actual risk itself. I think for me, the quality of the contractor is as important as many of the other factors. So not only are they going to do it, not only are their procedures good, but do they follow those through on site? You know, what's the policing like on site? That's probably more important on this type of building.
Include subcontractors as well. And
yeah, the subcontractors as well. It really is about the policing of the whole site.
Yeah.
Because you do have, the problem is the severity of a loss is going to be a lot higher than it would be for a timber or for a steel or concrete building, in theory. And in practice, that's what we've seen on similar sorts of buildings in schools, for instance, where there is more use of it. So for me, quality of the contractor, I think once the building's built, I'm sure there's going to be a lot about BIM and understanding the building and the fire stopping, so that when you get to the point years down the line when you get fit out contractors in to fit out a new office for a new company moving in, that they understand the nature of the building and they don't compromise it in any way. So all of these things, it really is, it sounds simple, but every underwriter and risk engineer here will probably be able to give you a story of when it's gone wrong, because somebody just hasn't thought about it. It's not a normal standard construction building. It may be standard construction in the future, but contractors need to get used to this type of building and things they need to do to protect it.
Yeah, and as Andy said, so it's not sort of just necessarily the contractor, it's subcontractor, and probably just as important, sort of the off-site production facility, since a lot of this, especially on sort of CLT and like, will be constructed off-site and then brought on site and sort of bolted together, erected. So they're just looking at the whole supply chain and each of the critical parties to that.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Andy, as well. That's good. Great. Okay. So that's a good start. So, Ollie, should we get our second poll question out?
Yeah, back to the polls, everybody. So there are two answers for this, please. So the first one is, how important is the price of insurance on your project during construction? Is it extremely important, very important? Is it moderately important? Is it slightly important? Or is it not at all important to you? So if you could just tick one of those boxes, please, and then, or circles even. And for part two, how important is the price of insurance on your project post-construction? Again, is it extremely important? Is it very important? Is it moderately important? Is it slightly important? Or is it not at all important to you? And just while we're waiting for you to all cast your votes, I just want to draw everyone's attention to, if you haven't spotted it already, the little Q&A tab down the bottom of Zoom. If you have any questions, we can't promise we'll definitely get to them, but if we don't, we will ask our panelists afterwards and try and get back to you. So please actively use that Q&A button down the bottom. Thank you.
Results in?
Results are in. So for part one, how important is the price of insurance on your project during construction? 11% is extremely important. Very was 37%. 33% moderately important. 15% said slightly important, and 4% said not at all. In terms of the second part, how important is the price of insurance in your project post-construction? 15% extremely, 48% very, 26% moderately, 7% slightly, and 4% not at all important. So relatively similar there in our findings.
So price is important either way. That's interesting. Okay. So David Lyle of Lockton and Dominic Lyle of Gallagher, what are the construction value thresholds for mass timber office buildings? And is there a point when it becomes too difficult, stroke uninsurable, both during construction and the built asset?
Yeah, so well, shall I deal with the construction side first? Obviously, that's a very sort of pertinent question, especially considering the poll. Yeah, it's very interesting that the results on that were very 37%, and then just sort of slightly behind, moderately at 33%. I'm very much of the view that with correct premium, insurance can be purchased for pretty much anything within reason, of course. And timber construction has, of course, been around since probably the early 1970s. So it's not necessarily a new item to this sort of scale we're talking about, sort of adds added complication. But I think probably key to the insurability is the early involvement of the brokers and the insurers. So getting them involved as early as possible, so build the imperative to get the correct information so this can be compiled, analysed, and basically brought out, bring everyone along on the journey. And reinsurance is pretty much going to be mandatory. The reason why I say reinsurance is mandatory is on a standard building, insurers can generally take, say, maybe sort of 75 million or more sort of themselves before they need to go out and get reinsurance. So go out and get another insurer to sit behind them. However, on timber construction, it's generally sort of less than 5 million. So getting reinsurers lined up is key, but there is a very buoyant reinsurance market at the moment. But all this does take time. As I said, it'll be key to bring everyone along on the journey. When I say everyone, involving the client, other experts, so that there is enough time to get the correct information and bring everyone, including the numerous insurers that will be required along in the journey.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think the real estate market appetite is probably fairly similar to that of the construction market, perhaps slightly more generous, but in a pretty similar space. Interesting that price seems to be slightly more important still on the completed asset. I was thinking it might be the other way around, but and David's, I think, touched on most of the points. Value thresholds again depend significantly on insurer and reinsurance limits, but they're not dissimilar to construction. I mean, to put it in context, I think to date still insure the largest timber frame or CLT building in the UK and possibly Europe, and it's insured. That's the good news. The bad news is it's more expensive, quite a lot more expensive than if it was made in concrete. That we have taken insurers hopefully on a bit of a journey there, and I think some of that comes down to the fact that we're in a hard market full stop at the moment. So CLT just therefore becomes even sort of further out of appetite. But the point is it's insured. The real challenge in terms of capacity and thresholds here, and David touched on it already, is insurers tend to want to take much smaller portions of a timber risk at the moment, and therefore from a sort of time scales and broking perspective, you require a lot more insurers to be involved on every placement, which then requires a lot more insurers to be notified every time something changes, and it becomes a significantly greater workload.
Yeah,
I don't think we truly know the answer to this question in terms of what the thresholds are, because I don't think we've fully tested them, but I get the sense from our panel, certainly our audience today, that we're about to test them.
Okay.
So
I'll just stick my 2 pennies worth in. Just what we're seeing at Marsh as well is buildings over 4 stories. So CLT type buildings over 4 stories is where insurers start to feel a bit more nervous, I think. So kind of the groundscapers that we see, so the big long 2-3 stories that are very wide, again are relatively easy to place, but once you start going up in the air much more than 4 stories, that's where again we need to get much more involvement at an early stage with contractors and insurers.
So bringing Caroline Hairsine in of Aviva as well, what would need to happen to increase these thresholds? Because it sounds like there's quite a delta there on a concrete-based design to a timber-based design. So what would need to happen to increase those thresholds, do we think?
I guess there's sort of 2 sides to it, really. So from the underwriting side, the information and the knowledge around mass timber and how, the structural integrity of it post-fire. So our assumptions are that once it's burning, we will lose a lot of the building. Now, it may be that it chars, but from our perspective, we cover physical damage. So Yeah, the life preservation side is great, but no developer wants to have a charred beam running through the centre of their building, so it will need to be removed and replaced, and of course that then incurs quite a huge material damage loss. So understanding about that and the acceptability of, if it was to charred, it could be, clad, would that be acceptable to developers? That would help, because then we wouldn't need to take the full value as our potential exposure. The second part is when we calculate what our capacity is, we look at what our expected maximum loss could be in the event of a fire or water damage event or whatever we take as our largest loss event. And we then have to add on the extensions to the policy. So, like your car insurance can come with, legal expenses or, all these other add-ons. So does a construction policy and a property policy as well. And we add those on. So there's debris removal, there's extra expenses, there's increased cost of working. And each of those comes with its own sublimit. So we can go from having a material damage loss of 20, 25 million, and then find there's another 40, 50 million of these extensions, which we need to take into account, because in the event of a loss, they can be called upon to claim. Yeah. So, if we take 2.5 million, that's our maximum line for timber frame construction. So we've gone from potentially writing 10% of a £25 million project loss to, only be able to write 5% because of all the extensions and coverage. So,
Okay, and Andy alluded to there, and I asked this question of Oliver Wright of Aviva. Does the height of a mass timber office building, as opposed to, say, a large ground scraper that Andy was alluding to just then, affect the appetite for insuring a mass building?
So I think, as was mentioned around the panel, that the higher the building, then the greater the risk generally for insurers as we work on the estimated maximum loss that could occur. If, for example, you had a fire just at ground level, whether it was 5 stories or 20 stories, we would have to take into account the potential of collapse from ground floor up. So that would then have an impact on the risk appetite, or maybe not so much the appetite, but as we've said, the capacity, the available capacity. And as you're going up more and more, you're almost certain to be adding on cost as well, which again is going to impact on the overall value of the project and therefore the capacity again. And then there's the third party aspect to factor in as well, if there's third party cover requested for any collapse potential. But also what we see in risk engineering is we also try to take into account the times when there isn't maybe a complete total devastating loss as well, and that could be as simple as you would expect a fire on, say, a second or third floor of a construction site. If it's in a busy area, you may reasonably expect a passerby or security to see the early beginnings of a fire, but maybe on a 20-story project, it'd be very difficult to identify any fire unless there's suitable detection in place before it's got to a runaway state as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So there is a fire brigade involvement there as well. But one positive I have seen on some projects is, say, a 4 or 5 story, maybe a few more. There's been a few in Elephant and Castle. I'm not sure if they did go ahead with CLT in the end, but I know years ago they were looking at developing some CLT projects in that area. Okay. And they were looking at ground floor or podium level slabs constructed of concrete. So you're instantly reducing your potential maximum loss. So capacity can then increase for insurers.
Thoughts there, yeah.
But also what you're able to do is reduce that sort of opportunistic arson, or the risk of a lot of waste being built up next to the building under construction as well. So you're reducing that potential for fire load and the potential for the fire to start in the first place.
Okay. That's helpful. So Nick Tilley of AXA, just taking on from there then, what view do you take in terms of the estimated loss with mass timber office buildings in contrast to other building types then?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And listening to Caroline and Andy in particular there, they were talking about capacity and the amount an insurer has an appetite to put down on a particular risk. And this whole setting of a loss estimate is really important. We need to understand, exactly what our potential loss is going to be. And the insurers do have different approaches to this. But generally, we're sort of looking at it exactly what's going to happen. Now, I mentioned I heard the fire and rescue service being mentioned there. I think one thing we need to really take on board fairly early on, and we certainly do, is that their prime role is for life safety. So once everybody's out of the building, they generally look back and they'll stand back and they will put defensive firefighting in place, so to stop the external spread to surrounding buildings. And many insurers look at worst case, so it's a free burn in order to set their capacity, and that then determines how much they can put on. But sort of turning that back now, looking at timber, and again, I've heard it is combustible. We can't get away from that. There is the charring element that comes into play, so you've got a sacrificial cross section that is still structurally stable, but it doesn't look good. It's not aesthetic. So can it really remain in place, or is that something that people could live with? And quite frankly, I think the former. I think it needs to be replaced is probably where we are. But when we're looking at setting those loss estimates, we've got to decide how far that fire is going to go. So we take into combination the actual structure, the combustibility of the structure, and what's in it, the actual contents, and maybe whether there are voids and what the fire barriers are. So ultimately, we're looking at what's going to be burnt and consumed in the fire, and then the collateral damage. So that comes onto that whole salvage potential, which relates to damage by fire, the products of combustion, the smoke, and also water. And what we need to start thinking about there is what's structurally undamaged. There could be part of the superstructure, but again, there might be something aesthetic to that needs to be replaced. It can't remain. It may just be the foundations that are left, quite frankly, on some of these where it needs to be demolished. And Robert mentioned earlier on the future structural deterioration after fire of timber. Again, that's something that we need to take a view on as to whether we feel there is some salvage potential. And water damage is quite a big one for timber. That takes many forms, so you can get staining. So again, aesthetically detracting. It could be mold. That's visual, and there are also health effects for that. So there's warping, delamination of CLT, where the glue has been involved and being deteriorated. But often we include on these buildings, we often see pod or modular construction. So we need to think about, well, can something be replaced? Is it a question of slotting in? Can that be done? Is there any method of doing that? And what's the evidence to say that it can be done? The other thing, last thing I just wanted to add there is that loss estimates from an insurer point of view about how much we might sustain as a loss, it's not just about the direct physical damage. It's also about the consequential damage to the business.
Yeah, of course.
We're picking up the loss of rent, we're picking up revenue, gross profits for that loss, and that can be for some considerable time. So essentially, it's quite a wide-ranging thing. There's the resilience of timber in a fire. It goes right the way back to it's combustible.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thanks, Ed. So Andy Desmond of Marsh, excuse the pun, the burning question of many on this webinar is what can be done to lower the premiums of mass timber office buildings?
Okay, thanks, Matt. So taking this in two parts, really. First is what we've spoken about already, which is to do with design of the actual building itself. So physical things such as sprinklers, and you can break that down to post-construction and during construction, so operational sprinklers, and you can also install construction phase sprinklers as well. So during my time at Kier, we had a couple of jobs where we actually installed construction phase sprinklers, and that worked really well. Then other design issues, things like reinforced concrete cores. I think it was Oliver also said things like having the first ground and first floor made of concrete, and then having your CLT put on top of that, so that reduces the arson risk. So if there's a fire outside the building or a skip catches fire, then you're much less likely to get a total loss. So the EML that insurers talk about, estimated maximum loss, where you have those ground floors made of concrete or a fireproof structure. So those kind of design things. Hybrid structures, again, as we're talking about, so maybe it's CLT with steel or CLT with concrete. So again, that's just reducing that physical design risk of the building. And then the second theme that we've been talking about is, I think Caroline's comment right at the beginning of this talk was often insurance is seen as, oh, we're starting digging on Monday, let's go and get some insurance. And with the CLT building, we really can't do that. So as much as we kind of promote early contractor involvement, and I think it was Andy that was talking about making sure that we have decent contractor selection, so making sure they've got experience of working with CLT, but also then bringing your insurance brokers on board as early as possible. What we would recommend at Marsh when we're doing a presentation to insurers is that we would want to see a fully formed fire plan, a fully formed water damage plan. What that includes things such as what are your sources of ignition, what are your sources of combustion, so what is your waste management plan, how do you get the waste out of the building, is it removed every day, are your skips covered or are they removed daily and emptied daily, what's your hot works system, have we managed to design out hot works, in the current climate it's a double-ended stick, unfortunately, because you design out hot works and then sometimes you have a corresponding increase in water damage claims. But so it's just making sure that insurers are aware that everything has been thought about. Sources, as I say, sources of ignition, sources of water damage have been thought about, planned, pre-planned, and it's done at an early stage so that by the time we come to construction on site, everybody's aware of what the plan is.
That's really useful, Andy. Thank you. Ollie,
oh, sorry, I just had one more point which was raised earlier on, which was to do with the completed assets. And it's something that's quite often forgotten about. So as a contractor, when you complete a building, all penetrations have to be signed off, and the fire stopping has all got to be signed off correctly. But often what you'll find is 5-10 years post PC, when a FM contractor has been in there, there's a number of penetrations into that building. So I think building owners really have to be, where they are planning on building a CLT building, they really have to be on top of this in terms of their FM contractor to make sure that they adhere to all of the rules and regulations that you would expect during construction in terms of their FM contractor, to make sure that any penetrations are then re-fire stopped and signed off. Otherwise, you can end up with a building in 5 years' time that's like a colander with all sorts of penetrations, and then the fire protection just isn't there.
That's great, Andy. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I suppose actually one of the other things on the penetration, as Andy sort of alluded to, that this can affect the sort of fire resistance of it, but also probably just as importantly on the moisture content, and utilising things like sort of water and moisture sensors both during construction, but also sort of sensors left in place for post, so that you don't get the situation which can occur of, say, 5 years down the line where there's moisture's got in and there's a whole pile of mould, where the rectification costs of those can be massive. So utilising technology can be key.
Very good. Thank you for that, David. Ollie, shall we have our third poll question?
Absolutely. Yep. Straight back to the polls then, please. Fingers on your mice. Again, it's split into two parts. So what's the maximum uplift in insurance premium you would be willing to pay when comparing insurance for mass timber with alternative construction materials during construction? Is it 0 to 50% increase? Is it 50 to 100% increase? Is it 100 to 200% increase in premium, or 300% plus increase in premium? And the second part is, what is the maximum uplift in insurance premium you would be willing to pay when comparing insurance for mass timber with alternative construction materials post-construction? Again, it's the same categories: 0 to 50%, 50 to 100%, 100 to 200% increase, and 300% plus.
Whilst you're answering those, don't forget to get those questions over if you've got any. I've got a couple rolling in, which I'll try and weave into other questions just in terms of time.
Yeah, I was just looking at that, Matt. We've had questions on examples from other countries, which I think you're already picking up on.
Yeah, I'll pick up. I've got that on my agenda anyway. So yeah, I'll weave that into that. Yeah.
Hybrid applications, we covered it. I think we do touch on it a bit later. And then codes, best practice, and compliance routes. Again, we've got some stuff planned in the session for that. So.
Hi, Peter. You've got your hand up. I think. Did you want to ask a question? Anyway, we'll let Laura pick that up. That's good. So have we got our results in?
Just coming through now. Okay, so for part one, which is during construction, 51% said 0 to 50% increase, 37% 50 to 100% increase, 9% said 100 to 200% increase, and 3% 300% plus increase. So there's less of an appetite for the over 300% increase in premium. Surprise, surprise. And then post-construction, 69% said 0 to 50% increase. 29% said 50 to 100% increase. 0% said 100 to 200% increase, but 3% were happy with a 300% plus increase. Perhaps not happy, but would consider it.
Thanks, Ollie. Okay, Nick Tilley of AXA and Andy Penny of Zurich. Do insurers take a different view of buildings using a hybrid application, for example, steel and timber as opposed to all timber? And do insurers take a different view on exposed timber versus, say, encapsulated timber of buildings?
Andy, do you want me to go first quickly on that one? Very, very briefly, it really comes down to what percentage of combustibles there are in the building, so we can categorise it. We're looking at how quickly a fire will spread, and clearly if there's a lot of combustibles and it's continuation of combustibles or continuity, then fire's going to track a lot more quickly. And the other part, we like to look at the life cycle of a building. So where timber has been encapsulated, how's that going to be maintained going forward in the future? Because quite often we find that's damaged or alterations are made and voids exposed. That's my very quick brief one on that.
Thanks for that, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things we're seeing quite a lot of at the moment is people building up. So where you have a concrete frame building, people are adding a couple of extra stories in timber. So replacing the roof, putting a couple of extra stories on. Yeah, that's, for us, you're still looking at a large loss, but you're unlikely to lose the whole building in that scenario. So, so again, I know there's been questions about hybrid buildings and what's where, but that to me is less of a risk. I'm still not putting any more than 5 million down, but it is less of a risk.
Great. Okay, so that's great. Thanks for that, Andy. Okay, so Dominic Lyon of Gallagher. Before this forum, we surveyed our panellists on whether mass timber offices have a different level of risk to other types of mass timber buildings, for example, residential, hotel, education. The results were mixed. A 40% said yes, 60% said no. But Dominic, in your experience, how do insurers view mass timber buildings that have different uses?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Good question. I believe the answer is yes, if I was to put that question. But I think Andy alluded to it earlier. It's worth re-emphasising. Insurers like to assess risk based on experience and data where possible. They are data-driven companies by modus operandi, and I think a lot of the challenges with timber at the moment comes down to an insufficient amount of data and historical analysis that they can use to trend projects going forward. So I think that's worth sort of highlighting. Coming back to this building that I mentioned earlier that we insured through construction and now insure it whilst it's operational. That's a residential building. Does that create more of a challenge than if it was offices? Yes. Is that because it's timber? Possibly, partly, but I think it's fair to say, I hope the other underwriters on the panel will nod, they assess buildings in terms of use regardless of material. I think some classes of buildings are higher risk than other classes of buildings, almost irrespective of material. It's almost when you combine a couple of those high risk factors, so let's say residential with timber, you suddenly come into a very high risk building, whereas if you put timber with an office building, where I would suggest from lost data, offices are probably slightly less risky than residential. There's a very, very sweeping statement. Then they're perhaps slightly more comfortable with it. And that's all driven by data, driven by losses, driven by balcony fires on timber frame or residential buildings. And if it's a timber frame residential building with a balcony fire, you can only imagine that scares an underwriter. I suppose my point is I think that insurers see timber as inherently more risky, and then if you have a higher risk end use, then they will see that as doubly risky. And it's about those combining those risk factors.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Dominic. Ollie, should we do our last poll?
So final poll of today, everybody. If insurance was no longer an issue, what percentage of buildings do you believe would be built partially or completely from mass timber by 2030? Is it less than 25%? Is it 25 to 50%? Is it 50 to 75%? Or is it 75 to 100%? If you could select a circle now, please.
Whilst that's coming up, next question will be for Caroline, Nick and Andy of Marsh, just to get you warmed up.
Answers just coming through now, Matt. So 14% of people voting said less than 25%, 31% said 25 to 50%, 43% said 50 to 75%, and 12% said 75 to 100%. So it just again reiterates how important insurance is to unlocking these barriers to mass timber office buildings.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Okay, so Caroline, Nick and Andy, do you think there is currently sufficient and consistent best practice guidance for insuring mass timber buildings? And what do you think could be done to achieve this, assuming that there isn't?
Well, shall I take this from a broker's view, and then Caroline and Nick, you can take it from an underwriter's view. So there is a lot of guidance out there, and certainly people like the STA, so Structural Timber Association, have just released some more kind of best practice notes, and the stuff that they're producing is really useful and good documents. But where I'd like to see the market going is to get some more guidance from insurers. So if we go back a few years, the likes of the Zurich School Design Guide, so when I used to work as a contractor, that was a document that we as a contractor, when we were designing schools, referred back to on a regular basis. So if we were doing a school building, we'd speak to our designers and make sure comply with the Zurich School Design Guide, and we know that that's a big tick in the box, and insurance is a lot more straightforward. So what I would like to see from a structural timber side of things is almost like that design guide, so but written from an insurer's perspective, to say, if we're looking at a CLT building, these are the key factors that you should be incorporating into that design in order to make us more comfortable. And whether we land at that being sprinklers throughout, or first floor concrete, or whatever the landing point is, at least that then gives owners, developers and designers a starting point to say, okay, well, if we comply with this, then at least we know that providing all our other ducks are in a row, then insurance shouldn't be so much of an issue.
Great, thanks, Andy. So Caroline,
from insurers, so from an insurer's perspective, so I guess there are murmurings of creating a code of practice. Now, there was the fire at Minster Court in 1991 that led to the development of the Joint Code of Practice for buildings, which is now standard and fully adopted in the London market. And we don't have one for frame, and we don't have one for water damage as well. And they're both big issues for us, well, for both sides of the fence on this, the developers and for us as insurers. So what we see in the US on timber frame construction policies are warranties, and they're quite well adopted. So we'll see hot works warranties, we'll see security warranties with certain requirements that have to be met. Requirements for waste to be taken off site every day, things that we've talked about already, but they're warranted in their insurance policy, so that if they fail to comply with them, the policy is voided. Now, under the Insurance Act in the UK, we can't get away with that as insurers, and rightly so. But there is a view, I think, that we could develop a code of practice that is incorporated into the policy that defines what we expect from our insureds to undertake while they're constructing the projects, and that would certainly help, I think.
And Nick, anything to add?
Yeah, just very quickly on that one. Escape of water was mentioned. Now, there is an approved document G under the building regs which covers escape of water. Not always followed, I'll hasten to add. And insurers, we are working on producing an insurer version of that, so sort of highlighting the features that we feel should be brought out and made very clear to during the construction of a building that the plumbing is done in a particular way. So we're sort of working on that anyway. Caroline mentioned Joint Code of Practice. Clearly, that's a key one. But what else is coming out? There's a Fire Protection Association Risk Authority document that's currently being put together, which is a questionnaire for mass timber constructed buildings. And it basically covers all the stuff that we would like to know in order to help us to understand the risk, really filling the gaps on information. So I think we are, there are things going on. It's just a question of orchestrating that, I think.
It's really helpful. Okay, so Robert Innes of Zurich, we've got a few live questions that we're going to struggle to do separately. So I'll probably merge those into this question here because they seem to relate to other countries. So the question for you, Robert, is are there examples from other countries that we should be looking at when considering the use of mass timber within the construction of office buildings? But related to that, there's a question from Andrew Wall, for example, relating to the view from insurers in other countries being insurers being more positive. And again, Gary Elliott, again, has raised a question about the environmental benefits and what is in other countries like the States, Canada and Europe, what they're doing to make the market more proactively help the situation to achieve what we need to achieve from a net carbon perspective. So just over, I mean, it's a very open area, Robert, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, timber buildings are being built, and they're being constructed, they're being operated and maintained very well. It's happening around the world. We've got projects in East London, 8 stories, 10-story buildings. We've got up to 18 stories in Norway and Canada, which are being built well. And not every timber building will burn during construction or operational. They will stand well. And I think the important thing for me is to understand how this is being done successfully. So it's communicating that. So it's understanding, if we have buildings in East London, who the contractor is, what measures have they put in place to manage that fire risk. And I think it's then getting that information from these successful projects and using that to also demonstrate how you're going to do something similar on your own project in order to give the insurance industry confidence, because we know it can be done. But I think, as Andy Penny alluded to earlier on, is in the UK, it's a very a niche market. There's not many timber construction. And what we have seen, there's the Blue Lamp building in Nottingham, part of the university campus, has burned down. So our experience of it to date is very limited, and of what we have seen is not necessarily the most positive. But I think it's just getting that information to insurers to say, we've seen this project, this is what they've done, this is what we're going to adopt, and we're going to do something similar. Because within say, Zurich, for instance, we only get to see Zurich projects. We don't understand what else has been happening out there. So as a risk engineer, we will go and see these projects, but we don't get to see, a project that's been underwritten by Aviva. So, and it's the same within the construction industry. It's very siloed. And I think there could be a lot more knowledge sharing, not from a negative claims point of view, but also from a successful point of view, as in what's been done and how it's been done.
That's great. Thanks for that. Okay.
Sorry, can I
was just going to jump on very, very quickly, just on from my side of things, if that's okay as well, on the, because I know everyone does raise that there's a lot more going on in the Nordic countries or in Canada and in the US, and I think a large part of that is understanding the driver for that. Whereas now, certainly globally, the driver is environmental. They actually already have timber and lots of it in supply. So it is also supporting their economies and their timber industry. So that was why, up to a point, it was driven there. There's also a lot that has to be built out of timber because of seismic risk in certain countries as well.
Yeah.
So that's one side of it. And as Caroline alluded to, the use of warranties and much more stricter controls by insurers in some countries. And also in the Nordic countries, specific to hot works, they have a lot more control on sites there through hot works, with a requirement that anyone involved in or signing off a permit or doing hot works has to do a fairly intensive course before they're even allowed to do that activity on site. They actually have a proper card permit system. So you've also got additional controls in place in certain countries there.
Great, thanks for that. So we are running out of time. So to wrap things up, a question for all of you as a panel: what can we as a collective do to improve the accessibility to insurance, and what actions do we need to take to help unlock the challenges we've discussed today and maximise the opportunities in this new growth area? Open forum.
So, go on, I'll just jump in quickly before Dom does. Just really wrapping up. So, from my perspective, it's really what we've spoken about. It's kind of early contractor involvement. It's choosing your contractors wisely, making sure that they've got the relevant experience of working with CLT. And just on that point, a lot of contractors, or maybe not a lot, but I know there are certainly a number of contractors that won't have timber exclusions under their annual facilities. So where you're looking at a smaller CLT opportunity, so maybe 20, 30 million type level, you'll find there are a number of contractors that can put that under their annual without all of the warranties and problems that we've been looking at in terms of project specific insurance. So that may be an option if you're looking at a smaller type development.
Okay. I've tried to summarise this into a catchy 3-word slogan of quantify, educate, differentiate. So I feel like I've been banging on about this for a few years already, but quantify the size of the opportunity. I think everyone appreciates part of the barrier to unlocking this is telling the insurance industry in real numbers the size of it and making them wake up and smell the bacon and see that it is a huge growth area and opportunity. Educate. Well, I think we're starting on that journey with things like this, but there's a huge amount to do in terms of educating ourselves and insurers in terms of what is happening in the sector and all of the best practice out there and what timber in the 21st century in the UK looks like, and all of these different products, and then differentiate. I think insurers are inherently competitive businesses, and they want to be able to differentiate between a good risk and a bad risk. So helping, again, us and them understand what the differentiators are and how to identify a best-in-class 6-story engineered mass timber building versus a really shoddy one that they wouldn't go near with a barge pole, and why yours is so much better than the average.
Great. Anyone else just to add one last piece?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of the things that I think from the insurance perspective we're not great at, but I think this is such a big and important issue that I think collaboration is key. So collaboration between brokers, collaboration between insurers, and collaboration between sort of different clients, as is happening here, so that together we can sort of move this forward and, well, as been shown by the polls, ensure that it does happen. And these are insurable, and insurance should never be a barrier to development.
That's great. Well, guys and Caroline, thank you so much for your time this morning. That's been fantastic. We've had a number of questions through the sessions. What we'll do, we'll download those and we'll get those answered with you as well to follow up with the forum more widely, and we'll get that done today. But great discussion. Thanks very much. So up next time, then we've got the. Hold on 2 seconds. We've got the fire testing and building control panel, which is on the 1st of September. You can see we've got our panellists lined up there. You can see that the session will discuss the issue of fire both during and post-construction. And we'll also focus on the work done by the fire engineers on behaviour of timber structures in the event of a fire, and to give confidence using this material both to end users and developers. So you can see we've got a great lineup there for that session. Next slide. And just for our closing thoughts, thank you all again for attending today. The response and the attendance has been fantastic. Don't forget to give us your thoughts and questions and objectives for the next session, and send those to Ollie, so that o.booth@gardner.com. But lastly, again, thanks to our panel. Fantastic, great discussion, and hopefully that was interesting for everyone. Take care.